Hi, I'm Scott, and I've got a problem. The other day while out riding, I noticed my clutch fluid was a lot lower than it used to be. The clutch system is a closed system, so you shouldn't ever have to top it up, which means it's leaking somewhere. So today, we're going to show you how to remove, rebuild, and reinstall the clutch slave cylinder on a 1500 Goldwing. Coming up next on Goldwing Docs. The clutch system on the Goldwing is hydraulic, so it's basically exactly the same as your brake system, except instead of a brake caliper at the other end, it's got a clutch slave cylinder that pushes a little post out that actuates the clutch in the transmission. As such, it's a closed system. There's a hydraulic reservoir. Your lever pumps the hydraulic fluid down to the clutch slave cylinder, which then pushes out that little post which actuates the clutch. When you let go of it, a spring pushes it back and the hydraulic fluid moves back up to the reservoir. There is nowhere for that fluid to go other than up and down that line. So if you ever see the fluid level starting to drop, that means you've got a problem. Unlike brakes you can actually see the fluid drop as the brake pads wear. The clutch system is not the same. It should always remain where it is. So if it starts going down, that means you've got a leak somewhere. And more often than not, the leak is down at the slave cylinder. Now there's actually a few different seals down on the slave cylinder that can wear out and leak, and depending on which one is leaking is going to determine how serious a problem this is. If it's the outer seal, that means when you pump your clutch lever, a little bit of fluid is going to ooze out in between the slave cylinder and the back of the engine cover. You'll know that because you'll see fluid dripping down the outside of the engine. If the inner seal fails, that's a whole nother thing altogether. That's extremely bad and very serious because that means the clutch fluid that was in here is actually getting pumped into the engine crankcase past that oil seal. Now you think, oh, it's just oil, it's fine in the engine. Actually, no. Getting hydraulic fluid in your engine crankcase oil is a disaster. It will actually destroy that fluid bearing layer on the main engine crank bearings, the smooth bearings. So you have your engine crank that's spinning inside these smooth bearings, and it depends on a thin film of oil to keep it lubricated. When you start pumping hydraulic fluid into your engine oil, it destroys that oil layer, and that means your bearings start contacting the crank and you will very quickly destroy your engine. It doesn't actually destroy the engine, it destroys the bearings and it might score the crank. However, the cost of pulling the engine on one of these bikes, splitting it and replacing all those parts far exceeds the cost of a new engine. So basically, if you start seeing fluid dropping on your clutch reservoir and you don't see a leak anywhere, stop riding your bike immediately, get that slave cylinder changed, and once you're finished, change the engine oil. It's a serious problem. It's happened to members of the Goldwing Docs forum where they have actually destroyed their engines because of leaking slave cylinder. With that in mind, let's get started on mine. Now I've got a whole bunch of parts here. Typically you'd only ever need to replace the seals, but I got all the different parts here just so we can see what the different parts are. Also, it never hurts to have the parts on hand. They're not that expensive, and if you start pulling things apart and find, oh look, the piston is actually scored, I don't have a piston on hand, now I'm gonna have to wait a week to go order one. Meanwhile, your bike is down in parts. So an extra $10 to buy a piston, we'll replace the piston. So I've got a spring, I've got a piston, I've got, let's see what else I got here. One of the oil seals, we've got the other oil seal, now this is the piston cup, and there's the other oil seal, and some new sealing washers for the banjo bolt in case we have to remove that. As is so often the case, we'll start by taking off the side covers. Now I've got straps holding my side cover on here so that if it ever flies off, I don't lose it because these are extremely expensive to replace. And then we'll remove the front cover. We're going to be spending some time rooting around on the ground this time because, as you can see, the only way to access this without removing the engine is from underneath. So here it is with the cover taken off. Here's my alternator. If we look down below, here is the bleed nipple for the clutch system. So we would take that off in order to bleed the clutch. And if we have a look underneath, There is our slave cylinder right there. I'm going to remove the bolt holding this hose stay, as it gives easier access to the nipple bolt behind it. First, the 10mm bolt holding on the bleed nipple is loosened and removed. Next, there are 3 more bolts that hold the slave cylinder in place that need to be removed. But before we undo the last bolt, we're going to remove the banjo bolt so that we can extract the slave cylinder easily. Keep in mind, as soon as we undo this bolt, we're going to start having hydraulic fluid leaking out. And the last one near the top. At which point we can now remove the slave cylinder. And with that, the slave cylinder will come out. And then we'll pull the actuating rod out as well so we can grease it up. Now if we have a close look at the slave cylinder, you can see that yellow crusty stuff that's all over. That's what hydraulic or brake fluid looks like once it leaks out and gets in contact with the air. So this is definitely leaking. You can see how it's been leaking for a while, enough that it's actually drained out here and started to crust. So it was time for this to get done. And then of course this is the actuating rod that fits inside the seal here and is pushed by the piston, and then actuates the clutch inside the transmission. Normally we'd push this out using the clutch lever. As long as the banjo bolt is still connected, we simply pump the clutch lever, it'll push the piston out. However, it's really difficult to do that when it's still installed in the bike and connected to that clutch lever. So what I normally do is I'll just pull it out of the bike, and then I'll use compressed air, apply it to the fitting there, and blow the piston out, which I'll do right now. And I just make a jury rig seal out of a shop towel. And you can see it just pops right out there. So here you can see the piston with the piston seal and the return spring. And then you can see the cup inside. And you can see all kinds of grime and gook in there. This is the lowest point on the system, so any contamination in that system actually ends up draining down to this area here and hopefully out through this bleed nipple. This seal here is what seals the piston inside the cup, or inside the cylinder rather. Here's the piston cup and the outer oil seal. And if you notice, the seal is actually narrower on the facing outwards. That's important because if you put that on backwards, it won't work. So we'll start cleaning this out by using some brake cleaner, just to spray out all the remnants of the hydraulic fluid. And we'll clean out the inside of the cylinder. We'll have a look at the cylinder itself. We want to make sure there's no scoring or corrosion on the inside of it. So once we get clean, we'll have a good look at that. I don't see any scoring. I see a tiny bit of corrosion inside there, but not enough that's going to affect the seal. Just a tiny bit of pitting. Okay, nice and clean. So next we'll start looking at our new parts. Here's our new piston. And our piston seal. Now, as you recall, we want it going on like this. Now, if we try and put that on there, it's probably going to rip. So what we want to do is actually lubricate it. And the way we'll lubricate it is actually using some brake fluid. We'll put some brake fluid onto a shop towel, and we will wipe it around the piston, as well as all around the seal. We want them both to be quite slippery. One last double check, triple check, make sure it's facing the correct direction, and then slip it over top, just like that. You can see the old one is quite old and worn out. Next, we'll install the oil seal. Once again, we will lubricate with brake fluid. And then press the oil seal into the piston. And this is where the rod will fit, right in just like that. And of course, a replacement clutch return spring. Just like that. Next, we'll use some more brake fluid again to lubricate the inside of the cylinder, as well as the outside of the seal. And then we'll gently press that into place. Make sure it goes in flat. Probably the trickiest part of the entire process. There we go. Perfect. We do want to apply just a little bit of grease around the outside of that piston. The service manual will have you do that first before you install the piston, but I find it then ends up contaminating the inside of the cylinder, so I just use a screwdriver to apply it after the fact like this. Just around the outside, and that's to allow it to slide in and out of the receiver on the back of the engine. So once we've lubricated that, I'll just clean off the top bit. We'll put a little bit of grease on the actuating rod, and then we'll install it into the slave cylinder. Now I find it much easier to actually install the rod into the clutch itself, then install the slave cylinder over top of the rod rather than the other way around, which is how the service manual would have you do it. Because you can easily just slide that into place. There we go. And it fits right over the dowels and is self-locating just like that. Now all we have to do is tighten it back into place. I don't know if you notice, it's a dead giveaway that my slave cylinder was leaking. Look at the paint here. See how it's bubbling up? Brake fluid will actually destroy paint. So if you get brake fluid on your plastic or paint or anything, it pretty much destroys it on contact. So the fact that the paint is all bubbling there indicates that there actually has been brake fluid leaking out of here. And you'll see right here the telltale hole. When it does leak, this hole is where it comes out, and that's to try to keep it from being injected into the engine crankcase. So I'm glad to see that because it indicates that there was no brake fluid actually going into the engine. And here's the banjo bolt with the new washer. So I put one washer over, put it through the banjo fitting, and then we have the second washer, and then that screws into the slave cylinder. Next, we're going to bleed the brakes. Incidentally, I will put links to all the different parts that you see here in the description below. Now obviously I've got an aftermarket switch quadrant on here. Normally you would just have the top of the clutch reservoir. As you can see, I've laid towels down all around below, so if any brake fluid does drip, it does not drip down onto my plastic. Here's my switch system. And as you will notice, the brake fluid has destroyed the paint on the bottom of the switch system. So we'll open this seal up here. And we'll clean this off with brake fluid as well. And our baffle float. And inside my clutch reservoir is a bunch of gooey muck. Obviously, this has not been flushed in a while. It really was overdue, so we'll do that right now. So first I'll mop up as much as I can out of here, of that muck. Then I'll spray brake cleaner in there. And then we'll mop up that brake cleaner, just diluting all that muck. All right, that's much better. My preferred method of bleeding is a vacuum bleeder. I find it much easier. So we'll pull that off there. So we'll loosen off that bleed nipple there. And as you see, they're already dripping. So we'll put our vacuum bleeder on there. Next, we'll add some fluid to the reservoir. And then we'll pump it out with the vacuum pump. And we're starting to get some fluid drawn through there, which is what we wanted to see. You can see it going through the hose here. So once we started getting some fluid, we want to make sure we top up. Too late. You want to top up the reservoir so that you don't start sucking air through the system like I just did. Now we got to start all over again. With any luck, we should now have a hard, full clutch. And we'll just pull off our bleeder, clean up any spilled hydraulic fluid, put the protective cap back on. And while we're here, when's the last time you drained these? It's a regular maintenance item. Some of the nastiest gunk you'll ever see come out of these, especially if you've been riding in the rain. Oily goo. Ugh. This went everywhere. That's your crankcase blow-by collector tubes. At this point, all that's left is to replace the covers. Well, that's it. Clutch is good as new, ready to go riding for another 80,000 miles before I have to do this again. If you liked what you saw here, please go ahead, click subscribe and click that little bell down below. It really helps us out. If you have questions about what you saw, or maybe you think you have a better way of doing something, please leave us a comment down below. And don't forget to check the Goldwing Docs forum. We're full of friendly people just waiting to help you with any problems you might have. Thanks for watching.